My name is Rachel Martinez, and the words my dying mother whispered to me at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday night in July shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. As I held her frail hand in the sterile silence of St. David's Medical Center, she looked directly into my eyes and said, "Mija, there's something I need to tell you before I go. You're not David's daughter, you're not even mine." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But what she didn't know was that I had already been questioning everything about our family for months, collecting pieces of a puzzle that never quite fit together. Sometimes the truth isn't revealed in a single moment of confession. Sometimes it's uncovered one painful discovery at a time, until the weight of evidence becomes impossible to ignore. The fluorescent lights in the hospital corridor had been humming the same monotonous tune for the past 6 hours. As I sat in that uncomfortable chair beside my mother's bed, watching her chest rise and fall with mechanical precision, Rachel Martinez had been fighting stage 4 pancreatic cancer for 8 months, and we all knew these were her final days. The doctors had given her weeks, maybe a month if we were lucky, but looking at her now, I realized even that estimate had been optimistic. I was 28 years old, working as a marketing coordinator for a growing tech startup in downtown Austin, living in a converted loft that overlooked the bustling energy of South by Southwest venues and late-night food trucks. My life had always felt predictable in the best possible way. Sunday dinners with the family, holiday traditions that had remained unchanged since childhood, and a sense of belonging that I had never questioned until recently. My father, David Martinez, was a third-generation Mexican-American who worked as a supervisor at a manufacturing plant on the outskirts of Austin. He was the kind of man who fixed everything with his hands, who taught my younger brother Danny and me how to change oil in our cars, and how to grill the perfect carne asada for family barbecues. He had met my mother when they were both 22, working at the same hospital where she was a nurse, and he was doing maintenance work while putting himself through trade school. Their love story had always seemed like something out of a romantic movie to me. Carol would tell us how David would leave little notes in her locker, written in his careful handwriting, asking her to meet him for coffee after their shifts ended. She would laugh about how nervous he was during their first real date, how he spilled salsa on his shirt at the Mexican restaurant, where he had planned to impress her with his knowledge of authentic cuisine. They had married after 2 years of dating, in a small ceremony at Sacred Heart Catholic Church in East Austin, surrounded by extended family and friends who had watched their relationship bloom from workplace friendship into deep, committed love. The photos from their wedding showed 2 young people who looked genuinely happy, genuinely in love, and genuinely excited about building a life together. Danny had been born 3 years after their marriage, and I had followed 2 years later. We grew up in a modest but comfortable house in Cedar Park, a suburb that offered good schools and safe neighborhoods for families who were working hard to provide better opportunities for their children than they had experienced themselves. My childhood memories were filled with the kinds of moments that Norman Rockwell might have painted. Saturday mornings helping my father work on projects in the garage while Spanish music played from an old radio covered in paint splatters and sawdust. Sunday afternoons in the kitchen with my mother, learning to make tamales for Christmas and pan dulce for special occasions, while she told stories about her own childhood and the recipes that had been passed down through generations of women in her family. Danny and I had been typical siblings, close enough to support each other but different enough to avoid too much competition. He had always been drawn to helping people, eventually becoming a registered nurse at the same hospital where our parents had first met. I had been more interested in creative pursuits, studying marketing and communications at the University of Texas, and finding work that allowed me to combine analytical thinking with creative problem-solving. The Martinez family had always felt solid, predictable, and loving, in ways that made me grateful every time I heard friends complain about their family dynamics or holiday gatherings. We actually enjoyed spending time together. We looked forward to family dinners and celebrations. We supported each other through challenges and celebrated each other's successes without jealousy or resentment. But over the past year, as my mother's illness had progressed and we had spent more time together in hospitals and medical facilities, I had begun to notice small inconsistencies that I couldn't quite explain. Nothing dramatic or obvious, just little details that seemed slightly off when I paid attention to them. During one of our many conversations in hospital waiting rooms, my mother had mentioned growing up in San Antonio, but when I asked her about specific neighborhoods or schools, her answers were vague and sometimes contradictory. She would say she remembered certain restaurants or landmarks, but when I looked them up later, some of them hadn't existed during the time period when she would have been living there. There were also physical differences that I had always attributed to genetic variation, but that seemed more pronounced when I really studied family photos. My hair was naturally much darker and straighter than either of my parents, and my facial features, while not completely dissimilar, had subtle differences that became more apparent when I compared recent photos side by side with pictures of my parents at the same age. My brother Danny looked exactly like our father had at 25. Same broad shoulders, same warm brown eyes, same easy smile that made people feel comfortable and welcomed. But when I looked at myself next to family members, I sometimes felt like I was standing next to people who shared some similarities with me, but who clearly belonged to a different genetic lineage. I had mentioned these observations to my boyfriend Tyler during one of our regular coffee dates at a small shop near the University of Texas campus, where we both enjoyed the energy of students and the constant buzz of intellectual conversation happening at nearby tables. Tyler was a software engineer who approached problems with logical, methodical thinking, and he had listened to my concerns with the kind of careful attention that made me feel heard without being dismissed. Tyler and I had been dating for almost 2 years, having met at a tech industry mixer where we had bonded over our shared love of true crime podcasts and our mutual frustration with Austin traffic. He was kind, intelligent, and patient in ways that made me feel supported without being suffocated, and he had become genuinely close with my family over the months we had been together. When I shared my growing concerns about family inconsistencies, Tyler had suggested that I might be overthinking things because of the stress of my mother's illness. Grief and anxiety could make people hyper-aware of details that might normally go unnoticed, he had pointed out. And it was natural for someone facing the loss of a parent to start questioning everything about their family history and identity. His response had been logical and compassionate, but it hadn't completely resolved the nagging feeling that something about my family's story didn't add up. I found myself paying closer attention to conversations, taking mental notes of details that seemed inconsistent, and occasionally researching information that my parents had shared about their past. The most significant discovery had happened 3 weeks before my mother's deathbed confession, during a conversation with my best friend Jessica. Kim, who worked as a freelance photographer, specializing in family portraits and wedding photography. Jessica and I had been friends since college, bonding over our shared interests in marketing and visual storytelling, and she had become someone I trusted completely with personal concerns and family issues. Jessica had been helping me organize family photos for a memory book that we were creating for my mother, something she could look through during her final weeks that would remind her of all the happy moments we had shared together as a family. As we sorted through boxes of photographs spanning nearly 3 decades, Jessica had made an observation that had stopped me cold. "Rachel," she had said, holding up a photo from my 5th birthday party, "has anyone ever mentioned that you look remarkably similar to the Chen family that lives in your neighborhood? I photographed their family reunion last year, and there were several women who could have been your sisters." I had taken the photo from her hands and studied it carefully. It showed me blowing out candles on a birthday cake, surrounded by family members who were smiling and clapping. But looking at it with Jessica's comment in mind, I could see what she meant about the physical differences between my features and those of my immediate family members. The Chen family that Jessica had mentioned lived about 6 blocks from my parents' house in Cedar Park, and I had seen them occasionally at neighborhood events and community gatherings. Michael Chen was a retired electrical engineer who had moved to Austin in the early 1990s with his wife and teenage children, building a successful consulting business that had allowed them to become active members of the local community. I had never paid particular attention to the Chen family beyond the normal neighborly politeness that characterized interactions in our subdivision. But thinking about Jessica's observation, I realized that I had occasionally noticed similarities between myself and some of the Chen family members, particularly Michael's sister Susan, who visited regularly and who shared my height, hair texture, and general facial structure. After Jessica's comment, I had started paying more attention to these physical similarities, and I had begun to wonder if there might be some distant family connection that I wasn't aware of. Many families in our area had complex immigration histories and extended family networks that spanned multiple generations and geographic locations, so it wasn't unusual for people to discover unexpected connections. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the similarities seemed too pronounced to be explained by coincidental genetics or distant family relationships. When I had mentioned this to my mother during one of our hospital visits, she had seemed unusually uncomfortable with the topic, changing the subject quickly and suggesting that we focus on more immediate concerns. Her reaction had been subtle, but it had been noticeable enough to add to my growing list of family mysteries that didn't seem to have satisfactory explanations. I had decided not to pursue the subject further while she was dealing with her illness, but I had filed the information away as something I might investigate more thoroughly after we had gotten through the immediate crisis of her medical situation. The night of her confession, I had been staying overnight at the hospital because her condition had deteriorated significantly over the previous few days. The doctors had warned us that she might not have much time left, and Danny and my father had been taking shifts, staying with her around the clock, making sure she was never alone. Tyler had offered to stay with me that night, but I had wanted some private time with my mother, hoping for the kind of intimate mother-daughter conversation that might provide closure for both of us. I had imagined we might talk about her hopes for my future, her memories of my childhood, or her advice for navigating life without her guidance. Instead, she had spent most of the evening drifting in and out of sleep. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Occasionally waking up to ask for water or to adjust her position in the hospital bed. The pain medication was keeping her comfortable, but it was also making her drowsy and sometimes confused about where she was or what time it was. Around midnight, she had woken up more alert than she had been in days, and she had asked me to help her sit up slightly so she could see my face more clearly. I had adjusted her pillows and pulled my chair closer to the bed, expecting her to ask about family members or to share some final thoughts about her life. Instead, she had taken my hand in both of hers and had started talking about guilt and secrets that she had been carrying for decades. She had spoken about choices she had made when she was young, that had seemed right at the time, but that had become more complicated as years passed and as the consequences of those choices had affected people she loved. I had assumed she was talking about general life regrets, the kind of reflection that often happens when people are facing the end of their lives and thinking about roads not taken or decisions they might have made differently. I had been prepared to offer comfort and reassurance, to tell her that she had been a wonderful mother and that any mistakes she had made were far outweighed by the love and support she had provided to our family. But then she had looked directly into my eyes and had said the words that would change everything I thought I knew about my identity and my family's history. "Mija, there's something I need to tell you before I go. You're not David's daughter. You're not even mine." The words had hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment I had been unable to process what she was saying. I had stared at her face, searching for some sign that the pain medication was causing confusion or hallucinations, but her eyes had been clear and focused, and her voice had been steady despite her physical weakness. "What do you mean?" I had whispered, still holding her hand but feeling like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. My mother had closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength for what she needed to say next. When she opened them again, there had been tears streaming down her cheeks, and I could see the weight of whatever secret she had been carrying for so many years. 29 years ago, I was working as a nurse in the maternity ward, she had begun, her voice barely audible above the hum of medical equipment surrounding us. There was a young woman, barely 18, who came in alone to deliver her baby. She was Chinese American, and she was terrified. Her family had disowned her because of the pregnancy, and the baby's father had disappeared when he found out she was expecting. I had felt my heart racing as she continued, but I hadn't interrupted, sensing that I needed to hear the complete story before I could begin to understand what she was telling me. The girl died during childbirth from complications that developed suddenly. There were no family members to claim the baby, and social services was going to place her in the foster system. David and I had been trying to have children for 3 years without success, and seeing this beautiful, healthy baby who needed a family felt like a sign from God. My mother had paused, watching my face for my reaction, but I had been too stunned to respond. She had continued talking, explaining how she and my father had worked with a social worker to begin adoption proceedings, but how the process had been complicated by the biological mother's lack of family support and documentation. We were told it would take months, maybe years, to complete a legal adoption, but we had fallen in love with you immediately, and we couldn't bear the thought of you spending months in foster care while paperwork was being processed. So we made a decision that seemed right at the time, but that has haunted me every day since. She had explained how she and my father had taken me home from the hospital as foster parents, with the understanding that they would eventually complete the adoption process. But complications had arisen with the legal paperwork, and somewhere in the bureaucratic confusion, official records had been lost or misplaced. By the time Danny was born 2 years later, we had been living as a family for so long that it seemed easier to just let people assume you were our biological daughter. We told ourselves we would explain everything to you when you were older, but as years passed, it became harder and harder to find the right time or the right words. I had sat in stunned silence, trying to process the implications of what she was telling me. Everything I had believed about my identity, my heritage, and my place in the world had been based on information that wasn't true. The family stories I had grown up hearing, the cultural traditions I had participated in, the genetic health history I had provided to doctors, all of it had been built on a foundation that didn't exist. Who was she? I had finally managed to ask. The woman who gave birth to me. My mother had reached into the drawer of her bedside table and had pulled out a small envelope that looked like it had been opened and resealed many times over the years. Her hands had been shaking as she handed it to me. Her name was Lisa Chen. She was Michael Chen's daughter. The name had hit me like another physical blow. Michael Chen, the neighbor whose family Jessica had said I resembled. Michael Chen, whose sister Susan shared my physical characteristics. Michael Chen, who had been living 6 blocks away from me for my entire life, not knowing that his granddaughter was growing up in the same neighborhood. I had opened the envelope with trembling hands and had found a birth certificate, a hospital bracelet with my birth weight and time of delivery, and a small photo of a young woman who looked remarkably like me. Lisa Chen had my eyes, my nose, my facial structure, and my hair texture. Looking at her photo was like looking at a version of myself from a different time period. The birth certificate had confirmed what my mother had told me. Lisa Chen had given birth to a daughter at 6:23 a.m. on March 15th and had died from postpartum hemorrhaging 6 hours later. The baby had been released into foster care pending identification of next of kin, but no family members had been located. Did you ever try to contact Michael Chen? I had asked, still staring at the photo of Lisa. My mother had shaken her head weakly. We were so afraid that he would try to take you away from us. We convinced ourselves that you were better off with a family who wanted you and could provide for you, rather than with a grandfather who might resent being responsible for a baby he hadn't planned for. I had understood their reasoning, but I had also felt anger building in my chest at the realization that they had made decisions about my life and my identity without considering what I might want or need to know. They had deprived me of the chance to know my biological family, and they had deprived Michael Chen of the chance to know his granddaughter. Does Dad know? I had asked. He knows everything I've told you, my mother had replied. This was a decision we made together, and we've both carried the weight of it for 28 years. The conversation had continued for another hour, with my mother sharing more details about the circumstances of my birth and the early years of my childhood. She had explained how they had moved from San Antonio to Austin, partly to create distance from people who might have known about the adoption situation, and how they had worked to create a new family history that would feel authentic and complete. She had also told me about the guilt she had felt over the years, particularly during milestone moments in my life when she had wished she could share my biological family's medical history or cultural heritage. She had researched Chinese American traditions and had tried to incorporate some elements into our family celebrations, but she had been afraid to go too far for fear of raising questions. By the time our conversation had ended, I had felt emotionally drained and completely overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I had learned. My mother had fallen back into medicated sleep, leaving me alone with information that had fundamentally altered my understanding of myself and my place in the world. I had spent the rest of the night sitting in that hospital chair, staring out the window at the Austin skyline and trying to process the implications of my mother's confession. Everything about my identity felt uncertain now. Was I Rachel Martinez, the daughter of David and Carol, raised in a loving Mexican-American family with strong cultural traditions? Or was I someone else entirely? A Chen family member who had been raised by strangers who had meant well but who had built their family on a foundation of secrets and lies. The next morning, when Danny and my father had arrived to relieve me, I had looked at them with completely new eyes. Danny was still my brother in every way that mattered, but he was no longer my biological sibling. My father was still the man who had raised me and loved me, but he was no longer my genetic father. The family dynamics I had taken for granted my entire life were now revealed to be more complex and fragile than I had ever imagined. I had decided not to share my mother's confession with them immediately, wanting time to process the information and to figure out what, if anything, I wanted to do with it. But looking at my father's face as he checked on my mother's condition, I could see the weight of the secret he had been carrying, and I understood why my mother had felt the need to tell me the truth before she died. Over the following days, as my mother's condition continued to deteriorate, I had found myself studying her face and trying to reconcile the woman who had raised me with the woman who had kept such a fundamental secret about my identity. She was still the mother who had taught me to ride a bicycle, who had stayed up all night when I was sick with fever, who had celebrated my achievements and comforted me during disappointments. But she was also the woman who had made decisions about my life based on fear and uncertainty, who had deprived me of relationships with my biological family, and who had allowed me to live for 28 years without knowing the truth about where I came from. I felt love and anger and confusion all at the same time, and I struggled to figure out how to move forward with information that changed everything, while also changing nothing about the practical reality of my daily life. My mother had died 3 days after her confession, peacefully in her sleep with our family surrounding her bed. The funeral had been a blur of relatives and family friends sharing memories and offering condolences, but I had felt like I was watching everything from a distance, still processing the secret she had shared, and wondering if I would ever feel settled in my identity again. In the weeks following the funeral, I had found myself looking at Michael Chen's house every time I visited my father, wondering about the grandfather I had never known and the family connections I had missed. I had also started researching Lisa Chen, trying to learn more about the young woman who had given birth to me and who had died so young that she had never had the chance to see me grow up. What I discovered during those early weeks of investigation would lead me down a path I never could have anticipated, toward revelations that would prove my mother's deathbed confession was only the beginning of a much more complex and surprising family story. The first thing I did after my mother's funeral was drive to the Austin Public Library and spend 6 hours researching everything I could find about Lisa Chen. Armed with her full name, birth date, and the hospital where she had died, I was able to locate newspaper obituaries, high school yearbook photos, and even some social media posts from classmates who had remembered her decades later. What I discovered painted a picture of a young woman who had been academically gifted, artistically talented, and tragically isolated during the final months of her life. Lisa had graduated as valedictorian from Anderson High School in 1995, with plans to study engineering at Rice University in Houston. She had been accepted with a full scholarship and had been featured in the local newspaper as an outstanding student who was expected to make significant contributions to her field. But something had happened during the summer before her freshman year of college that had derailed all of those carefully laid plans. According to the information I found, Lisa had never enrolled at Rice University, and instead had disappeared from her normal social circles for several months before surfacing at the hospital where she would give birth to me and lose her life. The newspaper obituary had been brief and formal, mentioning her academic achievements and her parents' names, but providing no details about the circumstances of her death or the baby she had left behind. Michael and Helen Chen were listed as surviving parents, along with a younger brother named David, and several aunts and uncles who lived in various parts of Texas. I spent hours staring at Lisa's senior portrait, trying to see myself in her features, and trying to imagine what kind of person she had been, beyond the academic accomplishments that had defined her public identity. She had my exact eye shape and the same slight asymmetry in her smile that I had always been self-conscious about. Her hair fell in natural waves that looked identical to mine when I let it air dry, and she held her head at an angle that I recognized from my own photographs. But beyond the physical similarities, I found myself wondering about her personality, her dreams, her fears, and the circumstances that had led to her becoming pregnant and estranged from her family. The scholarship student who had been destined for engineering success seemed incompatible with the frightened teenager who had died alone in a hospital. But I knew that people's lives often took unexpected turns that couldn't be predicted from their high school achievements. The more I researched, the more questions I had, and the more I felt compelled to learn the complete truth about my origins. My mother's deathbed confession had answered some fundamental questions about my identity. But it had also raised dozens of new mysteries that I felt driven to solve. I decided to start by trying to locate other members of Lisa's family, beginning with her younger brother David, who would have been my uncle. The obituary had listed him as surviving family, but it hadn't provided any information about where he lived or what he did for work. I spent several days using online search tools and social media platforms, trying to find current contact information for David Chen. Eventually, I located what appeared to be the right person living in Dallas, working as a software developer for a financial services company. His LinkedIn profile included a photo that showed a man in his early 40s who shared some facial features with Lisa, and his educational background included a degree from the University of Texas, which seemed consistent with the family's Texas connections. I spent several days debating whether to contact him directly, knowing that reaching out would mean revealing information about my existence that might be shocking or unwelcome. If Michael Chen had never known about my birth, then David Chen certainly wouldn't know that he had a niece who had been living in Austin for her entire life. Finally, I decided to send a carefully worded email that introduced myself as someone who was researching family connections and who believed there might be a relationship between our families. I mentioned that I had information about Lisa Chen and would appreciate the opportunity to speak with him about family history if he was interested in sharing memories or information. David responded within 24 hours, and his email revealed that he had indeed been wondering about missing pieces of his family's story for many years. He wrote that Lisa had disappeared during the summer of 1995 and had never contacted the family again, despite numerous attempts to locate her. The family had assumed she had died somewhere far from home, possibly as a result of whatever crisis had caused her to leave in the first place. He agreed to meet with me the following weekend at a coffee shop in Dallas, expressing curiosity about what information I might have and hoped that I might be able to provide some closure about his sister's fate. His willingness to meet gave me encouragement, but it also made me nervous about how to reveal the full truth about my connection to Lisa and the circumstances of her death. I drove to Dallas on a Saturday morning, arriving early at the coffee shop David had suggested, and spending 30 minutes rehearsing how I would explain my situation. I had brought copies of the documents my mother had given me, including Lisa's birth certificate and the hospital photo, but I was still uncertain about how much information to share during our initial conversation. David arrived exactly on time, and I recognized him immediately from his LinkedIn photo, though seeing him in person made the family resemblance even more obvious. He was tall and lean with the same dark hair and intelligent eyes that I had seen in Lisa's photos, and he carried himself with the careful precision that I associated with people who worked in technical fields. We made small talk for a few minutes while ordering coffee, but I could see that he was anxious to learn what I knew about his sister. Finally, he asked directly what information I had about Lisa and how I had become involved in researching her story. I had planned to ease into the revelation gradually, but looking at his expectant face, I realized that there was no gentle way to deliver the news I was carrying. I took a deep breath and told him that I believed Lisa had been my biological mother, and that she had died giving birth to me in 1995. David's reaction was unlike anything I had anticipated. Instead of shock or disbelief, his face showed immediate recognition and relief, as if I had confirmed something he had suspected for years. He leaned back in his chair and said quietly, "I knew she had been pregnant. I was the only one who knew." He explained that Lisa had confided in him during the early months of her pregnancy, swearing him to secrecy and begging him not to tell their parents. She had been dating a college student named Marcus Williams, who had been planning to transfer to a university in California. When Lisa discovered she was pregnant, Marcus had panicked and had broken up with her immediately, claiming that a baby would ruin both of their futures. Lisa had been devastated by Marcus's rejection and had been terrified of telling their parents about the pregnancy. Michael and Helen Chen had sacrificed enormously to provide educational opportunities for their children, working multiple jobs and saving every possible dollar to ensure that Lisa and David could attend college without financial stress. Lisa had felt that revealing her pregnancy would not only disappoint them, but would also jeopardize David's educational opportunities. She had confided in David because she needed emotional support, but she had also made him promise not to interfere with her decisions about how to handle the situation. David had been only 16 at the time, and he had felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of keeping such a significant secret while watching his sister struggle with an impossible situation. "She disappeared one night in July," David told me, his voice thick with emotion that had clearly been suppressed for decades. "She left a note saying she was going to California to find Marcus and that she would contact us when she got settled. But we never heard from her again, despite hiring private investigators and contacting authorities in multiple states." The family had spent years wondering what had happened to Lisa, alternating between hope that she was living somewhere under a different name and fear that something terrible had befallen her. They had never imagined that she had stayed in Texas and had died so close to home, or that she had given birth to a daughter who was being raised by another family. David asked to see the documents I had brought, and when I showed him Lisa's hospital, see of a large, close-knit extended family that gathered regularly to celebrate birthdays, holidays, and cultural traditions. Looking through the photos, I could see multiple family members who shared my physical characteristics, and I began to understand the genetic patterns that had shaped my appearance. But the most startling discovery came when Jessica showed me a photo of Susan Chen, Michael's sister, who appeared to be almost exactly my age, and who looked remarkably similar to me. In the photo, Susan was standing next to a woman who could have been my twin, and Jessica mentioned that the woman was Susan's daughter, Elena, who lived in Houston and worked as a graphic designer. "Rachel," Jessica said quietly, "I think you should see this." She handed me a photo that showed Elena Chen standing next to her car, wearing a University of Texas t-shirt, and smiling at the camera in a way that made her look like she could have been my sister. I stared at the photo in amazement, realizing that I had a cousin who was not only close to my age but who also worked in a creative field similar to mine. The idea that I had family members living in Texas who shared my interests and career aspirations felt almost too good to be true. Jessica had Elena's contact information from the family reunion photography session, and she offered to facilitate an introduction if I was interested in reaching out before meeting Michael. The idea of connecting with a cousin who was my age, and who might be able to provide peer perspective on the family dynamics, appealed to me enormously. That evening, I sent Elena a carefully worded message, explaining that I believed we were cousins, and that I had recently discovered my connection to the Chen family. I mentioned that I was planning to meet Michael soon, and wondered if she might be willing to speak with me about family history and relationships. Elena responded immediately with enthusiasm and amazement. She told me that the family had always wondered what had happened to Lisa, and that discovering she had a cousin she had never known about was incredibly exciting. She invited me to visit her in Houston before meeting Michael, suggesting that she could help prepare me for the family dynamics and cultural expectations I might encounter. I drove to Houston the following weekend, feeling nervous but optimistic about finally connecting with someone who shared my genetic background and who could help me understand the family I was about to join. Elena lived in a modern apartment near the museum district, decorated with artwork that reflected both her Chinese heritage and her Texas upbringing. Meeting Elena was like looking into a mirror that reflected not just my physical appearance but also many of my personality traits and interests. We had the same laugh, the same way of gesturing when we talked, and the same tendency to approach problems with a combination of analytical thinking and creative intuition. Elena told me about growing up in the Chen family, describing a culture that emphasized education, hard work, and family loyalty, but that also celebrated individual achievement and creative expression. She explained that Michael had always been supportive of family members who chose unconventional career paths, and that he would likely be proud to learn that his granddaughter had succeeded in marketing and communications. She also shared information about Lisa that David hadn't known, including details about Lisa's artistic interests and her dreams of combining engineering with creative design. Elena said that Lisa had been working on a portfolio of technical drawings that incorporated artistic elements, and that she had planned to pursue a specialization that would allow her to work on projects that were both functional and beautiful. Learning about Lisa's creative aspirations made me feel an even stronger connection to her memory, since my own career had involved finding ways to combine analytical marketing strategies with creative visual communication. It seemed that I had inherited not just Lisa's physical characteristics but also her drive to bridge technical and artistic disciplines. Elena also helped me understand some of the cultural traditions and family expectations that would be important during my meeting with Michael. She explained that showing respect for elders and demonstrating appreciation for family history would be crucial, and she coached me on appropriate ways to express gratitude for being welcomed into the family. The most valuable part of my conversation with Elena was learning about Michael's personality and emotional style. She described him as someone who felt deeply but who often had difficulty expressing emotions directly, particularly when dealing with painful topics. She suggested that I focus on sharing positive information about my life and my gratitude for the family that had raised me, rather than dwelling on the sadness of Lisa's death or the years of separation. Elena also offered to accompany me to the meeting with Michael, providing moral support and helping to facilitate communication if the conversation became difficult. Having an ally who understood both my perspective and Michael's seemed like it would make the meeting much more manageable. We spent the rest of the weekend exploring Houston together, visiting museums and restaurants that reflected the diverse cultural influences that had shaped Elena's identity. She showed me a Chinese cultural center where the family had participated in language classes and cultural celebrations, and she introduced me to foods and traditions that I had never experienced, despite living in Texas my entire life. By the end of the weekend, I felt like I had gained not just a cousin but a close friend who understood the complexity of growing up with multicultural identity in Texas. Elena had helped me realize that discovering my Chinese heritage didn't mean abandoning the Mexican-American culture that had shaped my values and worldview, but rather adding new dimensions to an identity that could encompass multiple influences. The drive back to Austin gave me time to process everything I had learned over the past few weeks, and to prepare emotionally for the meeting with Michael that was scheduled for the following Saturday. I felt more confident about the encounter knowing that Elena would be there to support me, and I was excited about the possibility of finally having answers to questions about my genetic background that I had been carrying my entire life. But I was also nervous about the emotional intensity of meeting a grandfather who had been grieving his daughter's disappearance for nearly 3 decades. I knew that our meeting would necessarily involve discussing painful topics, and I wanted to be prepared to handle whatever emotions might arise during our conversation. I spent the week before the meeting researching Chinese American cultural traditions and family relationships, wanting to understand the context that had shaped Michael's expectations and values. I also practiced explaining my own upbringing and family relationships in ways that would honor both my adoptive family and my biological heritage. Tyler had been incredibly supportive throughout my entire investigation, listening to my discoveries and helping me process the emotional complexity of learning about my biological family while grieving the loss of my adoptive mother. He offered to accompany me to the meeting with Michael, but I felt that the initial conversation should involve only family members who could speak from personal experience about Lisa and the Chen family history. The night before the meeting, I called my father to update him on what I had learned and to ask for his blessing as I prepared to meet my biological family. David Martinez had been struggling with his own complex emotions since my mother's death, dealing with grief over losing his wife, while also processing the revelation that the family secret they had kept for decades was finally being exposed. Our conversation was difficult, but ultimately healing. My father expressed regret about the decisions he and my mother had made to keep my adoption secret, but he also explained how much they had loved me, and how terrified they had been of losing me to biological family members who might have had legal claims to custody. He told me that he would always consider me his daughter regardless of genetics, and that he hoped my biological family would understand that I had been raised with love and strong values even if the legal circumstances of my adoption had been irregular. He also gave me permission to share any information about our family that might help Michael understand how I had been raised and what kind of person I had become. My father's support meant everything to me as I prepared for a meeting that felt like it would determine how my identity and family relationships would evolve going forward. I knew that the conversation with Michael would be just the beginning of a much longer process of integrating my biological and adoptive family histories, but I felt ready to take the first step toward understanding the complete truth about my origins. The morning of my meeting with Michael Chen dawned gray and humid, typical for Austin in late summer. but the weather seemed to mirror the nervous energy I felt as I prepared for what would undoubtedly be one of the most significant conversations of my life. Elena had driven up from Houston the night before and was staying at my apartment, providing moral support and helping me rehearse how I would introduce myself to the grandfather I had never known existed. We arrived at Michael's house in Cedar Park at exactly 2 o'clock, as planned. The neighborhood was familiar to me since it was only a few blocks from where I had grown up, but seeing it through the lens of my newfound knowledge about my biological family made everything feel different. This tree-lined street with its modest ranch-style homes had been part of my geographical landscape my entire life, but I had never realized that my genetic heritage was living so close to my adoptive family's daily routine. Michael's house was well-maintained but showed signs of being occupied by someone who had lived there for decades. The front yard featured carefully tended flower beds with plants that I didn't recognize, and wind chimes hung from the front porch that created soft musical sounds in the afternoon breeze. There was something both foreign and familiar about the aesthetic choices that made me wonder how much of my own preferences might have been influenced by genetics rather than environment. Elena squeezed my hand as we walked up the front steps, reminding me that she would be there to help facilitate conversation if I felt overwhelmed or uncertain about how to respond to difficult questions. We had agreed that she would make the initial introductions and would help ease the emotional intensity of our first meeting by providing context and family history that might be helpful for both Michael and me. The door opened before we had a chance to knock, revealing a man in his early 70s who looked remarkably similar to the photos I had seen of Lisa, but with the lined face and silver hair that came with decades of life experience. Michael Chen was shorter than I had expected but carried himself with the kind of quiet dignity that suggested both strength and gentleness. His eyes were the same dark brown as mine, and his facial structure was so similar to my own that there could be no doubt about our genetic relationship. For a moment, all three of us stood frozen in the doorway, as if we were all processing the reality of what was happening. Then Michael stepped forward and took my hands in both of his, studying my face with an expression of wonder and grief that made me feel like I was looking at myself reflected in his features. "You have her eyes," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You have Lisa's exact eyes." Elena introduced us formally, but the words felt unnecessary given the obvious family resemblance and the emotional weight of the moment. Michael invited us into his living room, which was decorated with a mixture of traditional Chinese artwork and American family photos that told the story of a family that had successfully blended cultural influences while maintaining strong ties to their heritage. The room was immaculately clean but felt lived in and comfortable, with bookshelves that contained volumes in both English and Chinese, and furniture that looked like it had been chosen for durability and comfort rather than fashion. There were photos everywhere, covering nearly every available surface, and I found myself drawn to the images that showed Lisa at various stages of her childhood and adolescence. Michael noticed my interest in the photos and began pointing out pictures of Lisa, sharing memories about family celebrations, school achievements, and everyday moments that had been preserved through decades of careful documentation. His voice grew stronger as he talked about his daughter, and I could see that sharing these memories was both painful and healing for him. "She was always curious about everything," Michael said, holding up a photo of Lisa at age 10, wearing a science fair ribbon and grinning at the camera. "She would take apart appliances just to see how they worked, and then she would try to put them back together in ways that would make them work better. Your grandmother used to complain that we never had a working toaster for more than 6 months because Lisa was always experimenting with improvements." I found myself laughing at the image of young Lisa as a household inventor, and I shared with Michael my own childhood tendency to reorganize and redesign everything from my bedroom furniture to my school supplies. Elena pointed out that this perfectionist creativity seemed to be a family trait, since she also had similar habits of constantly trying to improve systems and processes in her own life. Michael's expression grew more serious as he began to explain what had happened during Lisa's final year at home. He confirmed what David had told me about Lisa's academic success and her plans for college, but he also shared details about the pressure Lisa had felt to live up to the family's expectations and to justify the sacrifices her parents had made to provide educational opportunities. "We came to this country with very little," Michael explained, gesturing toward a photo of himself and his late wife Helen taken shortly after their immigration in the 1970s. Everything we did was focused on making sure Lisa and David would have chances we never had. But I think sometimes the pressure was too much for Lisa. She felt like she couldn't make any mistakes because it would mean wasting our sacrifices. Michael's insight into Lisa's psychological state during her final months at home helped me understand why she had felt unable to tell her family about her pregnancy. She had been carrying the weight of being the family's great hope for advancement, and revealing that she was pregnant by a boyfriend who had abandoned her would have felt like destroying not just her own future, but her family's dreams as well. Michael went on to describe the family's reaction when Lisa had disappeared, and the years of uncertainty and self-blame that had followed. He had always wondered if there was something he could have done differently to create an environment where Lisa felt safe asking for help, and he had spent decades replaying their final conversations to see if he had missed signs that she was in trouble. The not knowing was the worst part, Michael said, his voice breaking slightly. We hired private investigators, contacted missing person organizations, even had psychics try to help us understand what had happened to her. But we never imagined that she had stayed so close to home, or that she had been trying to protect us from disappointment. I felt tears welling up in my eyes as I listened to Michael describe the family's long ordeal of not knowing what had happened to Lisa. The irony that I had been living just a few miles away for my entire life, growing up in the same community where my biological grandfather had been grieving my mother's disappearance, was almost overwhelming to contemplate. Elena helped facilitate the conversation by asking Michael to share more. "He came from," Michael said, pointing to a photo of a young Lisa wearing traditional Chinese clothing during a cultural festival. But we also wanted them to feel like they belonged here, like they didn't have to choose between being Chinese and being American. His philosophy about cultural identity resonated strongly with me, since I had grown up in a Mexican-American family that had approached heritage and assimilation in similar ways. I began to see that I had been fortunate to be raised by people who understood the importance of cultural pride, even if the specific culture they had shared with me wasn't my biological heritage. As the afternoon progressed, Michael began sharing more personal reflections about his regrets and his hopes for our relationship going forward. He acknowledged that he couldn't replace the years we had lost or undo the circumstances that had kept us apart, but he expressed strong interest in becoming part of my life in whatever way felt comfortable for me. "I know I can't be the grandfather who taught you to ride a bicycle or helped with homework," Michael said, "but if you're willing, I would like to be the grandfather who helps you understand where you came from and who supports whatever dreams you want to pursue." His offer to establish a relationship without trying to replace or compete with my existing family bonds felt exactly right to me. I had been worried that connecting with my biological family might create conflicts with my loyalty to David Martinez and the memory of Carol Martinez, but Michael's approach seemed to create space for multiple relationships and influences. We spent time talking about practical aspects of integrating our families, including how to introduce me to other Chen family members, and how to handle the complex emotions that might arise as we navigated relationships that were both new and decades overdue. Elena offered to help coordinate family gatherings that would allow me to meet relatives gradually, without overwhelming anyone with too much change at once. Michael also expressed interest in meeting David Martinez, wanting to thank him personally for raising me with love and strong values. The idea of my adoptive father and my biological grandfather meeting felt both exciting and nerve-wracking. But Michael's respectful attitude toward my adoptive family made me optimistic that such a meeting could be positive for everyone involved. As our visit drew to a close, Michael presented me with a gift that left me speechless. He had prepared a photo album containing pictures of Lisa from birth through high school graduation, along with copies of her artwork, school papers, and personal letters that would help me understand who she had been as a person. "These belong to you now," Michael said, placing the album in my hands. "Lisa would want her daughter to know who she was and what she cared about. I've been keeping these things for nearly 30 years, hoping that someday I would have someone to share them with." Looking through the album, I felt like I was meeting my biological mother for the first time, seeing her not just as the frightened teenager who had died giving birth to me, but as a complete person with dreams, relationships, and a personality that had shaped who she was. The photos and documents painted a picture of someone who had been both intellectually gifted and emotionally sensitive, someone who had cared deeply about family, and had struggled with the pressure of living up to high expectations. One letter in particular caught my attention. It was something Lisa had written to herself during her senior year of high school, describing her goals for college and her hopes for her future career. In the letter, she had written about wanting to find ways to use engineering skills to create beautiful things that would make people's lives better, and she had expressed hope that she would someday be able to help other young women pursue careers in technical fields. Reading Lisa's own words about her dreams and aspirations made me feel a connection to her that went beyond genetics or shared physical characteristics. I could see that we had similar values and similar approaches to thinking about career goals, and I felt like I was beginning to understand how her influence might have shaped my life even though we had never met. Michael also gave me contact information for other family members who were eager to meet me, including several cousins who lived in various parts of Texas and who had been following the story of my discovery with great interest. He assured me that there was no pressure to establish relationships with everyone immediately, but that the extended family was excited about welcoming a new member and learning about the life I had built with my adoptive family. Elena and I stayed for dinner, sharing Chinese takeout that Michael had ordered from a restaurant that had been a family favorite for decades. As we ate, the conversation became more relaxed and natural, focusing on current events, shared interests, and plans for future visits, rather than the heavy emotional topics that had dominated our earlier discussion. I found myself feeling surprisingly comfortable in Michael's presence, despite the newness of our relationship and the complexity of the circumstances that had brought us together. His quiet manner and thoughtful approach to conversation reminded me of my adoptive father in some ways, and I began to see that I had been fortunate to have strong father figures in both my biological and adoptive families. The drive back to Austin gave Elena and me time to process the emotional intensity of the day and to talk through our impressions of how the meeting had gone. Elena was pleased with how well Michael and I had connected, and she felt optimistic about the possibility of integrating me into the larger Chen family network without creating drama or conflict. "He's been waiting for this moment for almost 30 years, Elena told me as we drove through the darkening Texas landscape. "Meeting you has given him something he never thought he would have. You've brought Lisa back to him in a way, and that's going to help him heal from grief he's been carrying for decades." I felt grateful for Elena's perspective and for her help in facilitating a conversation that could have been awkward or overwhelming without her guidance. Having a cousin who understood both my situation and Michael's emotional needs had made the entire experience much more manageable than it would have been if I had tried to navigate the meeting on my own. That night, I called Tyler to share details about the day and to process my feelings about everything that had happened. He was amazed by how well the meeting had gone and by the warmth and acceptance Michael had shown toward both me and my adoptive family. Tyler also expressed interest in meeting Michael himself, and I realized that introducing my boyfriend to my newly discovered biological family would be another significant step in integrating different aspects of my life. I also called my father to update him on the meeting and to share Michael's desire to meet him personally. David Martinez was moved by Michael's respectful attitude toward our family, and he expressed willingness to meet with Michael to discuss how they might both support me as I navigated relationships with both families. The conversation with my father was particularly meaningful because it represented a bridge between the family that had raised me and the family I was just beginning to know. Having both men willing to meet and to work together for my benefit felt like a resolution to conflicts I had been worried about since first learning about my biological heritage. Over the following days, I spent hours looking through the photo album Michael had given me, studying Lisa's face and trying to imagine what kind of relationship we might have had if she had lived. The pictures showed someone who had been confident and ambitious, but also thoughtful and caring. Someone who had taken her responsibilities seriously, but who had also known how to have fun with friends and family. I found myself wishing I could have known Lisa as an adult, wondering what kind of mother she would have been, and what advice she might have given me about career decisions, relationships, and life challenges. But I also felt grateful for the opportunity to learn about her through the memories and artifacts that Michael had preserved, and I began to understand that knowing my biological mother's story was valuable, even if I couldn't have a relationship with her. The most surprising discovery came when I found a letter Lisa had written but never sent, addressed to my future daughter, and dated just a few months before her death. In the letter, Lisa had expressed her fears about being a single mother, but also her determination to provide the best possible life for her baby, regardless of the challenges she might face. "I don't know what kind of mother I'll be," Lisa had written, "but I promise I will love you with everything I have, and I will do whatever it takes to make sure you have opportunities to pursue your dreams, whatever they might be." Reading those words felt like receiving a message from across time, a final gift from a mother I had never known but who had loved me enough to want the best possible future for me. I realized that Lisa's decision to go through with her pregnancy, despite the difficulties she faced, had been an act of love that had ultimately led to my being raised by people who could provide the stability and support she hadn't been able to offer. The letter also contained specific wishes Lisa had for her daughter's future, including hopes that she would be confident, educated, and proud of her heritage. As I read through Lisa's list of aspirations for my life, I realized that many of them had been fulfilled through the love and support of my adoptive family, even though they hadn't known about Lisa's specific wishes. That realization helped me feel like there was a meaningful connection between my biological and adoptive families, as if Lisa's love and David and Carol's love had somehow worked together to create the person I had become. The idea that my two families had been unknowingly collaborating to fulfill Lisa's dreams for my future felt like a kind of resolution to the conflicts I had been feeling about divided loyalties and competing influences. The week following my meeting with Michael brought an unexpected complication that would challenge everything I thought I understood about my biological family's story. I was organizing the documents and photos Michael had given me when I noticed something troubling about the timeline of Lisa's pregnancy and my birth. According to the hospital records my adoptive mother had kept, I had been born at full term. But if Lisa had become pregnant during her senior year of high school, as David had indicated, the dates didn't align properly with her graduation and the summer when she had disappeared. I spent several hours with a calculator and calendar, trying to reconcile the information I had been given with the official documentation of my birth. No matter how I arranged the timeline, there seemed to be a gap of several months that couldn't be accounted for by the story I had been told about Lisa's relationship with Marcus Williams and her decision to leave home during the summer of 1995. The discrepancy was subtle enough that it might have been explained by confusion about dates or incomplete information, but it was significant enough to make me wonder if there were still missing pieces to the story of my origins. I felt reluctant to question the narrative that Michael and David had shared with me, especially since our reunion had been so positive and emotionally healing for everyone involved. But the analytical skills that had served me well in my marketing career made it impossible for me to ignore inconsistencies that suggested the complete truth might be more complex than what I had learned so far. I decided to conduct some additional research before raising questions that might upset family members who were still processing the emotional impact of our recent reunion. I returned to the Austin Public Library and spent an entire Saturday afternoon researching birth records, hospital admissions, and newspaper archives from 1995 and 1996. What I discovered raised even more questions about the circumstances surrounding my birth and Lisa's death. According to the detailed hospital records I was able to access through public information databases, Lisa Chen had been admitted to the hospital not in 1995, but in March of 1996, nearly 8 months after she had supposedly disappeared from her family's home. The records also indicated that she had been living at a residential facility for pregnant teenagers during the final months of her pregnancy, and that she had been receiving medical care and counseling services through a Catholic charity organization. The revelation that Lisa had been in an organized support program rather than struggling alone completely changed my understanding of her final months and raised questions about why my adoptive mother had provided inaccurate information about the circumstances of my birth. Had Rachel Martinez been deliberately misleading me in her deathbed confession, or had she herself been given incomplete information about Lisa's situation? I spent the rest of the afternoon researching the residential facility mentioned in the hospital records. St. Catherine's Home for Unwed Mothers had operated in Austin from 1978 to 2001, providing housing, medical care, educational support, and adoption services for pregnant teenagers who needed somewhere to live during their pregnancies. The facility had been run by Catholic nuns and had maintained detailed records of all residents and their babies. According to the information I found, St. Catherine's had specialized in helping young women who had been rejected by their families because of their pregnancies, providing not just basic care but also counseling, education, and assistance with making decisions about whether to keep their babies or place them for adoption. The facility had worked with both licensed adoption agencies and individual families who were seeking to adopt infants. The discovery that Lisa had spent months in a supportive environment rather than struggling alone was comforting in some ways, but it also raised new questions about how my adoption had been arranged and whether the legal process had been as irregular as my adoptive mother had suggested. If Lisa had been working with professional adoption services, there should have been proper documentation and legal procedures that would have prevented the kind of confusion and secrecy that had characterized my upbringing. I decided to contact St. Catherine's successor organization, which had taken over the facility's records when it closed in 2001. After several phone calls and email exchanges, I was able to speak with a social worker who had access to historical files and who was willing to help me research Lisa's case. What Sister Margaret Murphy told me during our phone conversation was both illuminating and disturbing. According to the detailed records kept by St. Catherine's, Lisa Chen had indeed been a resident at the facility from September 1995 through March 1996, and she had been working with adoption counselors to plan for her baby's future. However, Lisa had not died during childbirth, as my adoptive mother had claimed. Instead, according to the facility's records, Lisa had delivered a healthy baby girl and had initially planned to keep the child and raise her as a single mother. She had spent 2 weeks at the facility after giving birth, bonding with her baby and making arrangements to move into subsidized housing that would allow her to work and attend college part-time. Lisa was actually one of our success stories, Sister Margaret explained. She was mature, responsible, and completely devoted to her daughter. She had made realistic plans for supporting herself and the baby, and she seemed confident about her decision to keep the child. The information Sister Margaret was sharing contradicted everything I had been told about Lisa's death and my subsequent placement with the Martinez family. I felt confused and somewhat frightened about what I might discover as I continued to investigate, but I knew I had to pursue the truth regardless of how complicated it might prove to be. Sister Margaret explained that Lisa and her baby had left St. Catherine's together in early April 1996, with arrangements in place for follow-up support and community resources. The facility's records showed that Lisa had been in contact with social workers for several weeks after leaving, reporting that she and the baby were doing well and that she was adjusting successfully to life as a single mother. But then, according to the records, all contact with Lisa had ceased abruptly in late April 1996. When social workers had attempted to conduct their scheduled follow-up visits, they had discovered that Lisa and the baby were no longer living at the address she had provided, and no forwarding information had been left with the landlord or neighbors. We assumed she had decided to move closer to family or had found better housing, Sister Margaret said. It wasn't unusual for young mothers to relocate once they got established, and Lisa seemed capable of managing her affairs independently. The facility had attempted to maintain contact for several months, but when their letters were returned as undeliverable and their phone calls went unanswered, they had eventually closed Lisa's file and moved on to helping other young women in similar situations. I asked Sister Margaret if there was any information in the records about how I had come to be placed with the Martinez family, but she said there was no mention of adoption proceedings or family placement services in Lisa's file. According to St. Catherine's records, Lisa had left the facility with her baby and had been planning to raise the child herself. The discrepancy between Sister Margaret's information and the story I had been told by my adoptive mother was so significant that I knew I had to investigate further. If Lisa hadn't died during childbirth and had initially kept me with her for several weeks, then something else had happened that had led to my placement with David and Carol Martinez. I spent the next several days trying to piece together what might have occurred during the weeks between Lisa's departure from St. Catherine's and my arrival in the Martinez family. I researched hospital records, police reports, and social services databases, looking for any information about Lisa Chen or a baby who might have been placed in emergency foster care during that time period. The breakthrough came when I discovered a brief police report filed in late April 1996, describing the discovery of a young woman's body in Lady Bird Lake, identified as Lisa Chen through dental records. The report indicated that Lisa had apparently drowned, though the circumstances were unclear and there had been no evidence of foul play. The police report also mentioned that Lisa had been found with identification, indicating she had a young infant, but no baby had been located at the scene. A social services investigation had been opened to locate the missing child, but the report I found contained no information about the outcome of that investigation. I felt sick reading the police report, both because it confirmed that Lisa had indeed died tragically young, and because it suggested that my placement with the Martinez family might have been the result of an emergency situation, rather than the planned adoption arrangement my adoptive mother had described. The idea that I might have been temporarily placed with David and Carol Martinez as an emergency foster placement, only to have that arrangement become permanent through bureaucratic confusion or deliberate decision, made much more sense than the story I had been told about Lisa dying during childbirth and my adoptive parents arranging a private adoption. I realized I needed to confront my father with this new information and ask him to clarify the real circumstances of how I had come to join their family. The conversation would be difficult, especially since David Martinez was still grieving the recent loss of his wife, but I knew I couldn't move forward with building relationships with my biological family without understanding the complete truth about my full adoption. I called my father and asked if we could meet for dinner at a quiet restaurant where we could talk privately. He could tell from my voice that I had discovered something significant, and he agreed to meet me that evening with a tone that suggested he had been expecting this conversation for some time. When I arrived at the restaurant, I found my father looking older and more tired than I remembered, as if the stress of keeping family secrets for nearly 3 decades was finally taking its toll on his physical health. He had always been a strong, energetic man who approached problems with practical solutions, but tonight he seemed vulnerable and uncertain in ways that made me feel protective of him, even as I prepared to ask difficult questions. I started by sharing some of the positive aspects of my meeting with Michael Chen, wanting to reassure my father that connecting with my biological family hadn't diminished my love and appreciation for him and the role he had played in my life. I told him about Michael's respectful attitude toward our family and his gratitude for the love and opportunities David and Carol had provided for me. But then I explained what I had discovered about the timeline of Lisa's life and death, and I asked him to help me understand how the story my mother had told me differed from the official records I had found. I could see the tension in his face as I described my research, and I knew that he was struggling with how much truth to reveal. Finally, David Martinez took a deep breath and began to tell me the real story of how I had come to be part of the Martinez family. His version of events was more complex and more ethically ambiguous than anything I had imagined, but it also demonstrated the depth of love and commitment he and Carol had felt for me from the very beginning. In April 1996, David had been working as a maintenance supervisor at the same hospital where Carol worked as a nurse in the pediatric ward. When Lisa's body had been discovered and authorities had been searching for her missing baby, the hospital had been contacted as part of the investigation into her recent medical history and social services contacts. Carol had been asked to assist with the search for Lisa's baby because of her experience working with children and her knowledge of local foster care procedures. When I had been located and brought to the hospital for medical evaluation, Carol had been assigned to monitor my care, while social services workers tried to identify appropriate placement options. "You were such a beautiful, alert baby," my father said, his voice growing emotional as he recalled that first meeting. "Carol fell in love with you immediately, and she started volunteering to work extra shifts just so she could spend more time taking care of you." The social services investigation into my situation had been complicated by Lisa's lack of local family connections and the absence of any legal documentation about my father's identity or potential relatives who might have custody rights. The caseworker assigned to my situation had been overloaded with other cases, and my placement had been delayed while bureaucratic procedures slowly moved forward. David explained that he and Carol had been going through their own fertility struggles at the time, having tried unsuccessfully to conceive for several years. When Carol had suggested that they volunteer to provide temporary foster care for me while social services completed their investigation, David had been initially reluctant, but had eventually agreed because he could see how much Carol cared about my welfare. "We told ourselves it would just be for a few weeks," David said, "but as days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months, you became such an important part of our lives that we couldn't imagine giving you up." The foster care arrangement had stretched on for nearly a year, while social services had continued their attempts to locate biological family members or suitable permanent placement options. During that time, David and Carol had provided my daily care, formed strong emotional bonds with me, and had begun to think of themselves as my parents in every meaningful sense. When social services had finally identified Michael Chen as my biological grandfather and had attempted to contact him about custody arrangements, they had discovered that he and his family were still grieving Lisa's death and were not prepared to take responsibility for raising an infant. Michael had been dealing with his own guilt and depression about Lisa's tragic end, and he had felt overwhelmed by the prospect of suddenly becoming a primary caregiver for a baby. The social worker told us that your grandfather wanted you to be placed with a loving family that could provide stability and opportunities, David continued. He felt that he couldn't give you the kind of care you deserved, and he asked that you be placed for adoption with people who were prepared to be full-time parents. According to David, the adoption proceedings had been handled through proper legal channels, with Michael Chen's consent and court approval. However, the process had been complicated by the unusual circumstances of my temporary foster placement and by Michael's request that the adoption be handled confidentially to protect his family's privacy during their period of grief. We were told that your grandfather didn't want any ongoing contact or updates about your life, David explained. He felt that it would be too painful for him to have reminders of Lisa, and he wanted to be able to grieve her death without the additional complexity of worrying about his granddaughter. The closed adoption arrangement had been presented to David and Carol as being in everyone's best interests, protecting Michael from ongoing emotional pain, while allowing my adoptive parents to raise me without interference or confusion about family loyalties. They had been advised not to maintain contact with my biological family, and had been told that I would be better off growing up without the burden of knowing about my tragic origins. We thought we were doing what was best for you, David said, tears forming in his eyes. We wanted you to have a normal, happy childhood without having to carry the weight of your mother's death, or worry about a grandfather who was too sad to be part of your life. David's explanation helped me understand the decisions my adoptive parents had made. But it also raised new questions about whether Michael Chen had really requested a closed adoption, or whether social services had made assumptions about what would be best for everyone involved. The Michael Chen I had met seemed like someone who would have wanted to know his granddaughter, not someone who would have chosen to permanently sever all connection. I asked my father if he had any documentation from the adoption proceedings that might clarify exactly what arrangements had been made and what agreements had been reached with my biological family. He said that he and Carol had kept all of the legal paperwork, but that he hadn't looked at it in years and wasn't sure what specific details it might contain. We agreed that I should review the adoption documents to better understand the legal framework that had governed my placement and to see if there were any clues about Michael's actual wishes regarding contact and ongoing relationships. David also agreed that it might be appropriate for him to meet with Michael directly to discuss what had really happened and to clarify any misunderstandings that might have shaped their decisions. The conversation with my father was emotionally draining but ultimately helpful for understanding the context that had shaped my upbringing. I could see that David and Carol had been trying to make the best decisions they could based on limited information and professional advice that might not have accurately reflected everyone's true wishes. I also realized that the tragedy of Lisa's death and the confusion surrounding my placement had created a situation where well-meaning people had made decisions that had kept loving family members apart for decades. The systems that were supposed to protect children and support families had instead created separation and secrecy that had benefited no one. The following day, I called Elena to update her on what I had discovered and to ask for her advice about how to approach Michael with this new information. Elena was shocked to learn that Michael had supposedly requested a closed adoption, since that seemed completely inconsistent with his personality and his approach to family relationships. Uncle Michael would never have wanted to lose contact with you, Elena said firmly. Even if he was grieving and felt unprepared to raise a baby, he would have wanted to know how you were doing and to be part of your life in some way. There's definitely something wrong with the story your adoptive parents were told. Elena suggested that we research the social services caseworker who had handled my placement to see if we could find additional documentation or perspective on what had really happened during the adoption proceedings. She also offered to talk with Michael about the situation, to get his version of what he had been told and what decisions he had actually made. I agreed that Elena should speak with Michael first, since I was concerned about how he might react to learning that his granddaughter had been living nearby for decades, when he had been told that maintaining distance was necessary for everyone's well-being. The revelation that we could have had a relationship all along might be painful for him to process, especially if it turned out that he had been misled by people he had trusted to handle the situation appropriately. Elena called me back that evening with information that confirmed our suspicions about the adoption arrangements. When she had asked Michael about his memories of the social services investigation and adoption proceedings, he had described a very different sequence of events than what my adoptive parents had been told. According to Michael, he had indeed felt overwhelmed by the prospect of raising an infant while grieving Lisa's death, but he had never requested a closed adoption or asked that all contact be severed. Instead, he had asked social services to help him find a good family for me, while maintaining some form of ongoing connection that would allow him to know how I was doing, and to be part of my life as I grew up. He wanted updates and photos, Elena told me. He specifically asked to be able to send birthday and Christmas gifts, and he hoped that when you got older, you might want to know about your mother and your Chinese heritage. Michael had been told by the social worker that my adoptive parents preferred a closed adoption arrangement, and that maintaining contact would be confusing and potentially harmful for my emotional development. He had been advised that the best thing he could do for his granddaughter was to step back and allow her new family to raise her without interference from her tragic past. He was told that you were better off not knowing about your origins until you were much older, and that trying to maintain connections would prevent you from fully bonding with your adoptive family, Elena continued. The social worker convinced him that requesting ongoing contact would be selfish and would interfere with your ability to have a normal childhood. The discovery that both my adoptive parents and my biological grandfather had been given incomplete or misleading information about each other's wishes was infuriating and heartbreaking. It seemed that a social worker had made unilateral decisions about what would be best for everyone involved, without accurately communicating the true feelings and desires of the people most affected by those decisions. Elena and I agreed that Michael and David needed to meet as soon as possible to compare their memories of what they had been told, and to begin the process of understanding how miscommunication had kept our families apart for so many years. We also decided that it might be worthwhile to try to locate the social worker who had handled my case, to see if we could get a clearer picture of why decisions had been made that seemed to contradict everyone's stated preferences. The prospect of facilitating a meeting between my adoptive father and my biological grandfather felt both exciting and terrifying. I knew that both men had my best interests at heart, but I was worried about how they might react to learning that they had both been misled about important aspects of my adoption and placement. I was also beginning to understand that discovering the truth about my origins was going to require not just processing my own emotions, but also helping both of my fathers work through decades of assumptions and regrets that had shaped their approaches to our family relationships. The journey toward understanding my identity was becoming a process of healing for multiple generations of people who had been affected by decisions made during a tragic and confusing time. The meeting between David Martinez and Michael Chen took place on a sunny Thursday morning at a neutral location that Elena and I had carefully selected. We chose a quiet park pavilion near Lake Austin, thinking that the peaceful outdoor setting might help both men feel more comfortable as they navigated what was certain to be an emotionally charged conversation about decades of missed opportunities and misunderstandings. I arrived early with Elena, both of us carrying coffee and pastries that we hoped might help create a more relaxed atmosphere for what could potentially be a confrontational discussion. We had spent considerable time planning how to facilitate the conversation, wanting to ensure that both men felt heard and respected, while also encouraging them to share honestly about their experiences and feelings. David arrived first, looking nervous but determined. He carried a manila folder containing all of the adoption paperwork he and Carol had saved over the years, along with some photos of me from various stages of childhood that he thought Michael might want to see. I could tell that he had been preparing for this conversation all week, probably rehearsing what he wanted to say and anticipating what questions might arise. Michael arrived a few minutes later, accompanied by Susan Chen, his sister, who had offered to provide moral support similar to the role Elena was playing for me. Susan was a woman in her 60s, with a gentle demeanor and keen intelligence that reminded me of Elena's descriptions of the Chen family's approach to handling difficult situations with patience and wisdom. The initial introductions were awkward, with both men clearly uncertain about how to interact with someone who represented such a complex mixture of gratitude, regret, and lost opportunities. But Elena took charge of the conversation, suggesting that each man share his memories of what he had been told during the adoption proceedings, and what he had understood about the other's wishes and circumstances. David spoke first, describing the emergency placement situation that had brought me into his and Carol's lives, and explaining how they had been told that my biological grandfather was too grief-stricken to maintain any connection with me. He shared copies of the social services documents that had guided their understanding of the situation, including official letters that had advised them that maintaining secrecy about my origins would be best for my emotional development. Michael listened carefully to David's account, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific details or timeline elements. When David finished speaking, Michael shared his own memories of the social services interactions, describing how he had been told that my adoptive parents preferred a closed arrangement and that requesting ongoing contact would be harmful to my adjustment and bonding with my new family. As both men compared their recollections and reviewed the documentation David had brought, it became increasingly clear that the social worker assigned to my case had systematically misrepresented each family's wishes to the other. Both families had actually wanted some form of ongoing connection, but neither had been accurately informed about the other's true feelings and preferences. The social worker, whose name was listed on several of the documents as Patricia Hawkins, had apparently decided that a completely closed adoption would be simpler and cleaner than trying to facilitate the kind of ongoing relationship that both families had actually desired. Her decisions had been presented to each family as being based on the other family's explicit requests, when in reality they had reflected her own professional judgment about what arrangement would be easiest to manage. "She told me that you needed a complete break from your past in order to heal from Lisa's death," David said to Michael, his voice heavy with regret. "She said that trying to maintain contact would keep the wound open and prevent you from moving forward with your life." Michael shook his head sadly. "And she told me that you and your wife needed to feel like Rachel's only parents, and that any involvement from me would undermine your authority and create confusion for Rachel about who her real family was." The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope and its consequences. Patricia Hawkins had essentially created a fictional narrative that had kept loving family members apart for nearly 3 decades, depriving me of relationships with my biological relatives and depriving Michael of the opportunity to watch his granddaughter grow up. Susan Chen, who had been listening quietly to the conversation, finally spoke up with barely controlled anger. "This woman made decisions about our family without our consent and without accurately representing our wishes. She stole 30 years of relationship from all of us based on her own assumptions about what would be best." Elena suggested that we try to locate Patricia Hawkins to get her perspective on the decisions she had made, and to understand what had motivated her to misrepresent each family's wishes so completely. David said he would use his connections at the hospital to research what had happened to social workers from that era, and Michael offered to contact a lawyer friend who might be able to help us understand what legal options might exist for addressing the situation. But even as we discussed the possibility of pursuing some form of accountability for Patricia Hawkins' actions, I could see that both David and Michael were more focused on the future than on relitigating the past. They seemed to understand that dwelling on anger and blame would not recover the lost years or create the relationship opportunities that had been stolen from us. The conversation gradually shifted from analyzing what had gone wrong to exploring what might be possible going forward. David expressed genuine interest in learning about my Chinese heritage and cultural background, saying that he had always wondered if there were traditions or family history that might have been meaningful for me to know about during my childhood. Michael, in turn, wanted to understand the values and traditions that had shaped my upbringing, expressing gratitude for the strong work ethic, educational priorities, and family loyalty that David and Carol had instilled in me. He said that knowing I had been raised with such love and attention made him feel like Lisa's sacrifice had resulted in something positive, even though the circumstances had been tragic. The two men began to find common ground in their shared pride in my accomplishments and their mutual desire to support my future goals and happiness. They talked about my career, my relationship with Tyler, and my interests in ways that demonstrated how much both of them cared about my well-being and success. As the morning progressed, David and Michael started making practical plans for how they might both be involved in my life going forward. David offered to share photo albums and mementos from my childhood that might help Michael understand how I had grown up, and Michael invited David to family gatherings where he could meet the extended Chen family network and understand the cultural context that was part of my heritage. The most moving moment of the conversation came when Michael thanked David directly for providing the love and stability that had allowed me to become a confident, successful adult. He said that knowing I had been cherished and supported made it easier for him to accept the years they had lost, because he could see that the outcome had been positive even if the process had been flawed. David, in turn, thanked Michael for being willing to welcome him into the extended family network and for not resenting the role he had played in my life. He said that meeting Michael helped him feel more secure about the decisions he and Carol had made, because he could see that my biological family consisted of people who would have loved and supported me if they had been given the opportunity. By the end of our meeting, both men had agreed to work together to help me navigate the complex process of integrating my two family histories and identities. They made plans to meet again soon, possibly including Tyler and other family members in future conversations about how to blend our different cultural traditions and create new family traditions that honored all aspects of my background. Elena and I drove back to Austin, feeling emotionally drained but optimistic about the progress that had been made. The meeting had exceeded our expectations in terms of the mutual respect and understanding that David and Michael had shown for each other, and we felt like we had successfully facilitated a conversation that could have gone badly if not handled carefully. Over the following weeks, both of my families worked to create opportunities for me to experience the cultural traditions and family relationships that I had missed during my childhood. Michael organized a Chinese New Year celebration that included traditional foods, decorations, and customs that helped me understand the heritage I had inherited from Lisa. David attended the celebration and seemed genuinely interested in learning about Chinese culture and participating in traditions that were new to him. Similarly, Michael and Elena joined my family for several Mexican-American celebrations that David organized, including a Day of the Dead observance where we honored both Rachel Martinez and Lisa Chen as important women whose memories deserve to be preserved and celebrated. Watching Michael participate in Mexican traditions while David learned about Chinese customs felt like a beautiful integration of the different cultural influences that had shaped my identity. The process of blending families also led to some unexpected discoveries about connections between my adoptive and biological heritage. During one family dinner, Michael mentioned that he had learned some Spanish during his early years in Texas, and David revealed that he had always been interested in learning about different cultures but had never had the opportunity to explore Chinese traditions. Their mutual curiosity about each other's backgrounds created natural opportunities for cultural exchange that benefited everyone involved. Michael taught David some basic Mandarin phrases and shared information about Chinese business customs that proved useful in David's work environment. David, in turn, introduced Michael to Mexican cooking techniques and helped him understand the historical context that had shaped Mexican-American identity in Texas. The relationship that developed between my two fathers was one of the most surprising and gratifying aspects of my journey toward understanding my complete family story. I had expected that integrating my biological and adoptive families might create tension or competition, but instead it seemed to create opportunities for mutual enrichment and support that benefited everyone involved. Tyler was fascinated by the family dynamics that were emerging and became an active participant in our blended family celebrations. He formed friendships with both David and Michael that were based on shared interests rather than just family obligations. And he seemed to enjoy the complexity and richness that came from being connected to multiple cultural traditions. About 6 months after the initial meeting between David and Michael, I received a phone call that provided an unexpected conclusion to our investigation into Patricia Hawkins' role in my adoption. Elena had successfully located Patricia, who was now retired and living in San Antonio, and had convinced her to meet with us to discuss the decisions she had made regarding my placement. Patricia Hawkins was a woman in her 70s, who seemed surprised that anyone was still interested in a case from so many years ago. When Elena and I met with her at a coffee shop near her retirement community, she initially seemed defensive about questions regarding her professional decisions and judgment. But as we explained the consequences of her actions and described how her misrepresentations had kept loving family members apart for decades, Patricia's defensive attitude gave way to what appeared to be genuine remorse and shock. She said that she had handled hundreds of placement cases during her career and hadn't realized that her decisions in my situation had been based on incomplete or inaccurate assumptions. I was young and inexperienced, Patricia admitted, her voice shaking with emotion. I thought I was making things simpler for everyone by arranging a clean break. I didn't understand that families might want to maintain connections even in difficult circumstances. Patricia explained that the social services training she had received in the 1990s had emphasized the importance of helping children form secure attachments with their primary caregivers, and that ongoing contact with biological family members had been viewed as potentially confusing or disruptive to that process. She said that she had genuinely believed that creating complete separation between my adoptive and biological families would be best for my emotional development, and that she had convinced herself that misrepresenting each family's wishes was justified if it resulted in what she perceived to be a better outcome for me. I told myself that everyone would be happier in the long run if they could move forward without the complications of maintaining difficult relationships, Patricia said. But I can see now that I robbed all of you of choices and opportunities that should have been yours to make. Patricia's explanation helped me understand the context that had shaped her decisions, but it also highlighted how individual social workers' biases and assumptions could have profound consequences for the families they were supposed to serve. Her good intentions didn't excuse the manipulation and deception that had characterized her handling of my case, but they did help me understand how such a situation could have occurred within a system that was supposed to protect children's best interests. Elena and I left our meeting with Patricia feeling like we had achieved some form of closure regarding the questions that had driven our investigation. While we couldn't recover the lost years or undo the pain that had been caused by her decisions, we had at least gained understanding about what had happened and why. More importantly, the process of uncovering the truth had led to relationships and family connections that were now providing ongoing joy and enrichment for everyone involved. My biological and adoptive families had not only reconciled but had actually become an extended support network that was stronger and more diverse than what any of us had experienced before. The integration of my two families reached a significant milestone about a year after my initial meeting with Michael, when Tyler and I decided to get engaged. Planning our wedding became an opportunity to create new traditions that honored all aspects of my heritage, while also reflecting our own values and preferences. Both David and Michael insisted on walking me down the aisle together, symbolizing the equal importance of both families in my life and my future. The ceremony incorporated elements from Mexican, Chinese, and American traditions, creating a celebration that felt authentically representative of who I had become, through the influence of multiple cultural backgrounds. The wedding reception featured foods from all three cultures, with David's family contributing traditional Mexican dishes, Michael's family providing Chinese specialties, and Tyler's family adding American favorites that represented his Midwestern background. The combination created a festive, inclusive atmosphere that celebrated diversity, rather than trying to minimize differences. During the reception, both David and Michael gave speeches that acknowledged the unusual journey that had brought our families together and expressed gratitude for the opportunity to be part of my life and future. Their words demonstrated how much both of them had grown through the process of learning to share parenting responsibilities and cultural influences. The most emotional moment of the evening came when Michael presented me with a piece of jewelry that had belonged to Lisa, explaining that he had been saving it for the day when he could share it with his granddaughter. The necklace was a delicate jade pendant that Lisa had received for her 18th birthday, and Michael said that wearing it would help me carry her memory and her blessings into my marriage. David, not to be outdone, presented Tyler and me with a check representing money that he and Carol had been saving for my wedding since I was a child. He said that contributing to our celebration felt like the completion of a parenting journey that had been one of the greatest privileges of his life. The gifts from both fathers represented not just their individual love and support, but also their acceptance of each other's roles in my life, and their commitment to continuing to work together as I entered this new phase of my journey. About 2 years after Tyler and I married, I became pregnant with our first child. The pregnancy brought new opportunities for both of my families to participate in preparing for the next generation and to share their hopes and traditions with the baby, who would carry forward elements of all our different backgrounds. David and Michael both expressed excitement about becoming grandfathers, and began planning ways to share their respective cultural knowledge and family traditions with their future grandchild. They collaborated on creating a nursery that incorporated elements from both Mexican and Chinese design traditions, and they made plans to teach the baby to speak both Spanish and Mandarin in addition to English. The prospect of having a child who would grow up knowing and appreciating all aspects of her multicultural heritage felt like the ultimate resolution to the identity questions that had driven my search for truth about my origins. Instead of having to choose between different cultural influences, my daughter would be able to embrace all of them as natural and integral parts of who she was. When our daughter Sophia was born, both grandfathers were present at the hospital, working together to support Tyler and me during labor and delivery. Watching them collaborate to care for Sophia during her first days of life demonstrated how completely they had integrated their approaches to family and parenting. Sophia's birth also prompted Michael to share more detailed information about Lisa's personality and dreams, as he wanted his great-granddaughter to understand the legacy of strength and determination that she was inheriting from her biological great-grandmother. He created a photo album specifically for Sophia that would help her understand Lisa's story and the sacrifices that had been made to ensure her family's survival and success. David, similarly, wanted Sophia to understand the values and traditions that the Martinez family had contributed to her heritage. He began working on a family history project that would document the immigration story of my adoptive grandparents and the hard work and perseverance that had created opportunities for subsequent generations. The collaboration between my two fathers in creating educational materials for Sophia demonstrated how much they had both grown through the process of learning to share family, responsibilities, and cultural influences. Instead of competing for primary influence over the next generation, they had learned to work together to create a richer, more comprehensive foundation for Sophia's identity and values. As Sophia grew from infant to toddler, she became the bridge that fully united our extended family network. She learned to say Grandpa David and Grandpa Michael with equal enthusiasm, and she seemed to intuitively understand that having multiple grandfathers and cultural traditions was something special rather than something confusing. Watching Sophia interact with both sides of her family helped me realize how much healing had occurred since that night when my adoptive mother had made her deathbed confession. What had started as a revelation that shattered my understanding of my identity had ultimately led to a family structure that was stronger and more loving than anything I could have imagined. The journey from my mother's confession to Sophia's birth had required confronting painful truths, processing complex emotions, and learning to forgive people who had made imperfect decisions during difficult circumstances. But it had also resulted in relationships and understanding that had enriched everyone involved. Looking back on the investigation that had consumed so much of my emotional energy for nearly 2 years, I realized that the most important discoveries had been about the capacity for growth, forgiveness, and love, rather than about the specific facts of my biological origins. Learning about Lisa and connecting with the Chen family had been meaningful, but learning to integrate multiple family loyalties and cultural influences had been transformative. The woman who had died giving birth to me would have been amazed to see how her daughter had ultimately been raised by an entire network of people who loved her and wanted the best for her future. Lisa's sacrifice had resulted not just in my survival, but in the creation of family bonds that spanned multiple generations and cultural backgrounds. My adoptive mother's deathbed confession had been intended to relieve her own guilt and provide me with information about my origins. But the investigation that followed had revealed truths that were more complex and ultimately more hopeful than anything Carol Martinez could have anticipated when she decided to share her secret. The story that had begun with a revelation about lies and secrets had evolved into a celebration of truth, connection, and the possibility of healing even the most complicated family relationships. Instead of destroying my sense of identity and belonging, learning about my biological family had expanded my understanding of what family could be and how love could transcend the boundaries of genetics, culture, and time. Today, when people ask me about my family background, I tell them that I'm Mexican American through adoption and Chinese American through birth, and that both aspects of my heritage are equally important to who I am. Sophia is growing up understanding that families can be created through choice as well as genetics, and that the love and support she receives from multiple sources makes her stronger rather than more confused about her identity. The DNA results that I eventually obtained confirmed what we had already established through research and family connections, but they seemed almost anticlimactic compared to the relationships and understanding that had been built through the process of searching for truth. The real revelation hadn't been about my genetic makeup, but about the capacity for healing and growth that exists within families who are committed to honesty, forgiveness, and love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.